MademmyifyASMR. Hello and welcome back to MademmyifyASMR, and welcome of course to another True Crime Tuesday. Sorry, I can see where. Bit of lipstick there. Today's True Crime Tuesday is a little bit different because I am using my iPad rather than my notebook because I ended up typing up all the notes and I couldn't be bothered to rewrite them by hand. Today's case was also a requested case from Megan, who is from the beautiful city of Cardiff in Wales, and this case is the case of the Cardiff 3. That is actually a case that I didn't know anything about, and it made me so angry reading about some of the things that happened and the injustice in this case. Sorry, trying to remember my own passcode. But yeah, this case was basically just a massive miscarriage of justice. 3 innocent men were sent to prison, and yeah, well, you'll see when I get into the story. Also back to contact lenses this week, because my glasses have like a green tint on them. It makes it a nightmare to edit when I use the ring light and the green screen, so I'm going to try and keep with the contact lenses, but we'll see, because sometimes my eyes just are like, no, thank you. So yes, let's get on with the case of the Cardiff 3 and the murder of Lynette White. Lynette White was born on the 5th of July 1967. White had left school without any qualifications and had been working as a prostitute since the age of 14. Tim Rogers, who was a BBC Wales journalist, interviewed White a few weeks before her murder as part of an investigation into child prostitution, and Rogers commented that White was probably one of the most well-known or most visible prostitutes in Cardiff at the time. Acquaintances said she would be the first girl out at lunchtime and the last one in on a night, even working on Christmas Day. She was described by friends as pretty and popular. White earned around £100 each night. She told Rogers that she had been drugged and taken to Bristol by a gang of men who had forced her initially into prostitution, and that even after eventually making her way back to Cardiff, she had found herself trapped in a continuing spiral of prostitution. By 1988, she was working every day to pay for her boyfriend at this club until around 1 a.m. and it's not known if she left with a client or left alone. She was actually due to be called as a witness for the prosecution in 2 forthcoming trials, and it was later, like, they thought maybe the fact she had seen her known associates was perhaps that she was laying low, or trying to avoid giving evidence in these trials. The first trial involved an allegation of attempted murder, and the second involved an allegation of attempting to procure the services of a 13-year-old girl for prostitution. When White disappeared, the police had begun actively searching for her, and the judge in one of the cases had issued a warrant to arrest her, and to assure she attended the first trial, which was meant to commence at Cardiff Crown Court on the 15th of February 1988. Now, earlier that February, another prostitute, Leanne Vilday, had loaned White the keys to a flat in James Street, where this would be the flat where she was later murdered, and she'd given her the keys to this flat so that she could use that space to take her clients. But by the 14th of February, Vilday wasn't able to get into the flat herself, and she couldn't find Lynette White. On the afternoon of February the 14th, a woman was walking down James Street, and she saw a man who had blood all over his hands stood in a doorway, and the doorway where he was stood was next to the flat where Lynette took clients. This man was apparently mumbling to himself, crying, and the woman carried on walking because she didn't really want to have a conversation with this strange man. And she walked down to the docks and kind of stood looking out to sea. Then she felt someone sit down next to her. "Hi, Rossi, please come say hi to his fans." "Down, please, down." Yeah, she was looking out to sea, and she felt someone sit down next to her, and she realised that this was the man who she'd seen on James Street that was now at the docks. William Diamond, who was a taxi driver who drove around the Buttown area of Cardiff every evening. He had talked to a lot of prostitutes when he was doing his taxi rounds, but apparently he never used their services. But he got to know Leanne Vilday and Lynette White very well. On February the 14th, he'd stopped on Bute Street, and he'd spoken to Vilday, who had asked him if he could drive her to James Street, as she'd not seen Lynette White for 6 days. Vilday managed to persuade another flat occupier to drop a spare set of keys from a window. She then let herself through the main door, but she couldn't get into her own flat. She returned to the car and said that there was something wrong because she could see through the letterbox that the door to the kitchen was closed. It had been tied shut with a piece of string that was tied to the handle and tied to a worktop. He drove her to Buttown Police Station, where they spoke to PC Simon Johnson, and they explained that they were worried about Lynette. PC Johnson at the trial told the court that he was aware that Lynette White was a missing witness in a court case, and that other police officers were looking for her, and so he PC Anthony Prosser, who now is retired, said at the trial that they would drive to James Street hoping to arrest Lynette, as they'd been looking for her all weekend. They had to kick down the internal door to the flat, and on searching the bedroom they found Lynette massive injuries. Lynette had her throat slit and had been stabbed over 50 times. There was blood all over the room, including a bloody handprint on the wall. There was also blood found on Lynette's jeans that was not her own. An unused condom and money was still left on the side. So the robbery didn't seem to have been the motivation behind this attack. They also found azoospermic semen, which is semen with no sperm associated with it, which is normally associated with infertility rather than having a vasectomy, in her underwear and vagina, and this had been deposited 6 hours, or within 6 hours of her death, so it may not have been her murderer, but she had this azoospermic semen in her underwear. Crime Watch aired a reconstruction of the events and issued a photo fit of the man the witness had seen, asking to come forward to be questioned further. One thing that became apparent through the course of the investigation was how well liked in the local area Lynette was. Everyone spoke highly of her, and a number of her clients actually came forward to help with the investigation, to kind of like rule themselves out and give any information they could. And a £1,000 reward was offered by Lynette's friends and family for any information that would lead to an arrest. On February the 25th, the police detained an individual who bore a striking resemblance to the E-Fit, but he was released the following day after providing an alibi corroborated by a third party. The suspect outside the flat has apparently never been positively identified. The police investigation was led by Detective Chief Inspector John Williams, who was the head of Wales CID. Prostitute murders are considered very hard to solve, just due to the number of contacts, as it were, that a prostitute would have on a day-to-day basis. But John Williams had an unbroken solve record. In the initial investigation, Francine Caudle, whom White was due to testify against, and Caudle's mother, Peggy Ferrugia, were considered suspects, but the discovery on White's clothing allowed them to be eliminated from police inquiries, bearing in mind that this is the 80s, so the most advanced that the testing technology would be to determine a blood type, so if they weren't that blood type, they were ruled out. Stephen Miller was questioned at the beginning of the inquiry, having been picked up by police early on the morning of February the 15th, but after giving a statement detailing his whereabouts during the crucial period, he was released without charge, and police announced at that time he had been ruled out as a suspect in the investigation, but we'll be coming back to Stephen Miller later. When Miller was first taken in by the police for questioning, he was actually still wearing the clothes that he would have been wearing, like he'd been wearing them for a couple of days. They were dirty and unwashed, and the police even joked with Miller during his initial interview that he should sit in the opposite corner of the room due to the smell. But there was no trace of blood found on any of his clothes. His car was also forensically examined, and they found nothing. Another witness, David Orton, also gave a statement to the police detailing his movements with Miller during the time of the murder, which kind of corroborated Miller's alibi. On the 20th of April 1988, DC Jeff Thomas put together a list of 12 people of interest based on previous criminal activities. One of the men, whose identity has never been publicly revealed, was referred to only as Mr. X, and he was a convicted sex offender and associates. The police's main concern was that this Mr. X would voluntarily commit himself to a mental institution if he became aware that he was being watched. By October the 25th, D.I. Moucher was so convinced that this Mr. X was the killer that he requested further surveillance, and this took place between the 27th and 30th of October 1988, and then on November the 7th, 1988, DCI Adrian Morgan informed DCS Williams that Mr. X was now the prime suspect. Now, I'm not really sure why this changed, because they were so convinced it was Mr. X, and then suddenly, well, you'll see when I got into the next bit. In the November, the police had another breakthrough as several key witnesses came forward to say that they had lied in their initial statement to the police and to confessed some involvement in the killing. Those who came forward were Leanne Vilday, Angela Fasila, who was a former flatmate of Vilday's and also a prostitute, and a man called Mark Gromick, who lived in the flat above Lynette White. They named not the original white male who was Mr. X, but 5 men of colour. The men they named were Ronald Actie, his cousin John Actie, Tony Paris, Yusuf Abdullah, and Stephen Miller, who was Lynette's boyfriend at the time of her death. While some of these men did have criminal backgrounds, most of their criminal records were for petty crimes such as shoplifting, nothing that would have been like, oh yeah, they would definitely murder someone. These men were arrested on December the 9th. There was no forensic evidence at all linking them to the crimes. It was literally just the word of Leanne Vilday and Angela Fasila. The police were notified on the 10th of December that Fasila's blood type was AB, which was the same type of blood type found on White's sock and trousers. They re-interviewed her the following day, insisting that it was her blood that was found on White. Fasila gave a new version of events, this time claiming that she and Vilday had been present when White was murdered and had taken part in the killing. She also named Stephen Miller, Ronnie and John Actie, Tony Paris and Yusuf Abdullah as the killers, and said that Vilday had been responsible for slitting White's throat. Vilday then gave a new statement on the same day, naming the same people as the killers and saying that she and Fasila had both been forced to cut one of White's wrists to ensure that they had been complicit in the crime, so they would remain silent. Interestingly though, at one point Vilday implicated another man who it turned out was totally innocent, and Vilday even later admitted that she had only named this person because she didn't particularly like them, yet her word was still considered reliable. After the arrest of the 5 suspects, 4 of the men stuck to their same story, maintaining their innocence. Police needed a confession as there was no forensic evidence linking them to the crime, so police decided they should focus their interrogations onto Stephen Miller. Miller had a very low IQ and was assessed by psychologists as being highly suggestible. Over a period of 4 days, Stephen Miller was interviewed on 19 occasions for a total of 13 hours. He was denied a solicitor for the first 2 interviews, and Miller confessed to the killings after making 307 denials. Miller also implicated the other men who had been accused. Now, I've listened to the recordings of the police sources that says like his solicitor, when he was allowed him, massively let him down because he allowed Stephen Miller to be led. And basically it was something like on the third interview they planted this seed with Miller that, oh, maybe you did it but you were on drugs and you just don't remember because you were so high. And like when he confessed he was like, oh yeah, maybe I was, yeah. And it's ridiculous. Anyway, Yusuf Abdullah had an alibi when he was questioned. He had been working 8 miles from Cardiff on a ship at Barry Docks. A colleague confirmed this alibi as he had seen Abdullah 15 minutes before the murder apparently took place, though Abdullah would be implicated again by an unexpected source. He did not realise at the time, but his common-law wife, Jackie Harris, was having an affair with Jeff Smith, who was a senior South Wales police officer within the Vice Squad. His common-law brother-in-law, Ronnie Williams, was also a police informant. Williams began passing information to the police in March of 1988. Much of it was unreliable, including a claim that White had been stabbed in the Casablanca club in Buttown before moving to the flat in James Street. Initially, he claimed that Abdullah knew the identity of the killer and was concealing this information, but later he began to implicate him more directly with the murder and claimed that Abdullah had been able to leave work from the ship on the night of the murder without his colleagues being aware. It was well known by the associates and the police that Abdullah and Williams absolutely detested each other. At the trial, the jury chose to believe Ronald Williams. Allegedly, Ronald believed that he had seen Yusuf Abdullah in a pub just before the murder took place. He later claimed that maybe he had been confused due to the long night shifts. There was a second statement taken from another labourer who worked on the ship that night, but this statement was never read in court Yusuf Abdullah was treated for post-traumatic stress disorder after his release from prison, and he began campaigning on behalf of victims of miscarriages of justice and for the reopening of the investigation into White's murder so that the correct man could be found. In an interview in 1996, he said, "Until it happens to you, no one can have any idea what it's like to be convicted for a murder you didn't commit. We've been really messed up by what we've been through. We needed counselling, but it wasn't offered to us. Being inside really did my head in." In the year 2000, the case was reopened as a sample of blood was found on a cigarette packet that was in the room at the time, and further traces of the same blood were found underneath several layers of paint on the skirting board in the room, but there were no matches to the blood in the National DNA database. But in January 2002, DNA technology advanced to the point where they were able to build a reliable DNA profile from the blood found at the scene. The police then used a process of familial searching, which is where they look for DNA that could be, that is a partial match, someone who could be related within the National Police database, and this DNA profile was matched to a 14-year-old boy who, of course, he wouldn't have been alive at the time of the murder of Lynette White. And this led to the arrest of the boy's uncle, Jeffrey Gafour. The DNA evidence against him was so strong that Gafour just confessed, and in July 2003, Jeffrey Gafour was sentenced to life in prison. He apologised to those who had been wrongly convicted after his conviction, but as you can imagine, they weren't exactly willing to accept his apology. After this conviction, several further trials took place. In 2007, a trial took place accusing 4 witnesses from the original trial of perjury. In December 2008, Angela Fasila, Leanne Vilday and Mark Gromick were found guilty and sentenced to serve 18 months in prison. The 4th man, Paul Atkins, never made it to trial as he was deemed unfit to stand a trial as he had severe learning difficulties. In 2009, it was decided that there was enough evidence against 13 officers involved in the original investigation to charge them with conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. 2 further witnesses from the original trial, Violet Perriam and Ian Massey, were also charged with perjury. When the trial began in 2011 against the police officers involved, it was the largest police corruption trial in British history. During the trial, the defence raised concerns about non-disclosure of certain documents by the prosecution. In January 2011, the judge ordered the prosecution to provide these documents, and it was found that 4 of these documents were missing. This prompted an investigation by police, who found that these documents had allegedly been destroyed back in 2010. Because of this, the defence urged that the prosecution could not guarantee a fair process, and the judge should order a not guilty verdict. Current Labour leader Keir Starmer, who at the time was one of the most senior prosecutors in the country, supported this decision, and the trial collapsed. The entire case was referred to the IPCC, the Independent Police Complaints Commission. Those missing documents showed up again in 2012 in the office of the sergeant who had allegedly ordered them to be destroyed. So yeah, I feel the corruption definitely came from the top down there. Then finally in aged just 49, and Ronnie Actie, who had been tried but found innocent, also died in his back garden. I think it didn't say how he died, just that it was ruled as non-suspicious circumstances,